Welcome to Chapter 2, Colonial Worlds, 1607 to 1750. Here we have our map, which indicates the time period of European claims in North America. We have our French, our British, and our Spanish claims. And if you recall back from Chapter 1, we kind of got into the concept of European exploration and colonization. And so we continue with that theme. Here we see these major nations landing here in North America and battling over who will get what territory and when. If you recall from U.S. history, what you learned in high school, or if you're taking it now, in addition to this course, you will recall the time period of the French and Indian War. And yes, good old George Washington leading the troops against the French. And long story short, what ends up happening is the British do win. But that's a little bit before this time period, because we see on the map, and let me try to get my screen pointer out really quickly, that we have these disputed areas. Up above, these lines indicate that the British and the French were fighting over the Canadian land, okay? Here where I'm circling New France, this was land at the time owned by, guess who? The French. So in modern day terms, we're looking at the area of modern day Mississippi, North Dakota, South Dakota. Here down below, we have half of Texas that was taken over by the French. On the other side of the border, this way, moving towards the southwest, if you follow my pen, you'll see that we're looking at the claims that were taken by the Spanish lands. Look, Spanish Florida, and then this is land disputed by the British and the French that I'm circling right now. And then the eastern seaboard, where I'm circling to the east. So the region or the colonies of New York and New Jersey and Philadelphia, New England, I'm pointing to now, all British-owned land. So by this time period, we see that North America in totality was becoming a home to a wide range of cultures and societies, and definitely expectations for women were different. Now, the thing that we're going to focus on in particular with this chapter is the view and the expectations for women in the South, in those British colonies versus the northern British colonies. This lecture is much shorter than Chapter 1. I've chosen to pick out a select few historical figures that kind of shed light on, number one, the difference between the southern and the northern colonies, as well as this concept of we have a mixture of these cultures of the French and the Spanish and the English. You know, you're expected to read the textbook as well in this chapter, and we do have readings on this as well, which more so elucidate that concept of the different expectations of the women in the British southern colonies versus the British northern colonies. You should take note that by 1650, we have about 25,000 British subjects that lived in New England, and another 15,000 that lived in the Chesapeake region. In Chesapeake region, we're talking about kind of this area of Maryland, Pennsylvania. Here we go. Let me get this out. Where I'm circling right now, Virginia. So we start with our southern British colonies. I'm going to refer back to the Virginia Company quite a few times, so make sure you take note of that as well. The Virginia Company was originally founded in 1606 by King James I. Originally, the Virginia Company was meant to create new settlements in Virginia and North America. So again, the Virginia Company was originally meant to create new settlements in Virginia. However, over time, the Virginia Company started to take on quasi-governmental powers. So, for example, they were doing things like minting their own money. We also see that the Virginia Company dabbles in selling women. That's right, selling women. Tobacco owners would trade approximately 120 pounds of tobacco in exchange for their bride. So we have tobacco brides, women being sold for tobacco to be taken in by these tobacco farmers as the wife and the mother. They were considered probably the wealthiest and the upper echelon of the classes of women we're going to talk about today. Because tobacco farmers, as we know from chapter 1 with Pocahontas and her husband, they made a good amount of money. I want you to be aware that tobacco was a hot commodity back in the day. And even today it's still a hot commodity, but back then it was a big deal, just like tea and coffee were a big deal back then. So if you were able to raise that tobacco, you were going to make quite a bit of money and do very well in life. And so these women had that extra money to spend on frivolous things, like beautiful gowns imported from foreign nations, like beautiful furniture that was expensive or silverware. They had time to devote to needlework. They lived in elegant mansions. The other thing that's interesting is that they were in charge of overseeing the servants and the slaves. They were in charge of their family. So they weren't just sitting back and doing frivolous things, which they could do and they could afford to do. They had the time and the money, but they also had this responsibility of overseeing the servants and the slaves. The lower class women were the indentured servants. In my point of view, I consider indentured servants almost like slaves. They weren't slaves, but the way they were treated and the things that they had to do was almost like that of a slave. Women between the ages of 13 and 25, men too, but we're focusing on the women, would flood from Ireland, Scotland, England, Germany, would flood in as immigrants to North America looking for this golden dream of freedom and opportunity and a new life. They would sign a contract, here we go again, with the Virginia Company. They would sign a contract in which they would give up a number of amount of years of life. Could be 20 years of their life, could be 25 years of their life, something like this, in which they promised to work the land, hard manual labor. They would do this. Sometimes, believe it or not, they would have to pay out of their own paycheck to use some of the utensils or the tools, rather, for planting and hoeing and whatever they had to do to work on the fields. So they would devote all of their lives to this hard manual labor, and once they fulfilled the contract and they ended that, let's pretend, about 20 years of their life, then they were free and they could go and live their lives. Were they paid? Yes, but it was grossly under what a typical worker who was free and hired would get paid. So, it wasn't the woman's place to do this hard manual labor. Typically, that was the place of the man. However, there was such a desire to produce these cash crops, and there was so much labor that was needed to do this, that desire overrode the woman's proper place, and her proper place, of course, was in the home, or what we call the domestic sphere. Well, these indentured servant women were not allowed to legally marry. Why? Because they were beneath the dirt. That's how they were viewed. Like they were lesser than. Okay? They were there. They were not like these upper class, beautiful tobacco brides with their money. They didn't have that stature. They didn't have that title. So as an indentured servant, of course they got into relationships, and about 20% of these indentured servant women became pregnant out of wedlock because they could not get married or whatever the case might be. And if they were caught, they were publicly whipped and fined for the pregnancy or for the sexual act. Little to say, it's not a big surprise to us that a lot of them were subject to sexual exploitation. But what we see is the Virginia law of 1643 changes who becomes the lower class, and also it changes the role of the indentured servant woman, because with this law, there was a tax put on the labor of African slave women, putting them in the same category as a paid male. White women were exempt from the tax. So this is the point. We see a shift of white women, including indentured servant women, back into the domestic sphere. But why? Why would this be? Because we see an increase of slaves reinstituted into this traditional gender role. In other words, the law is making a distinction between white and black women. This is based on race. And I assume that you have some knowledge about the whole time period of colonization with the slavery and what that entailed. So for the British, they needed this labor. They needed manual labor. At first, they took in the indentured servants because that's what they had, but as time went on, it was so much cheaper, more readily available to have these slave women working the land. So this allowed, in the British view, white women, because of their color, their race, really don't belong doing this manual labor. But we have, again, in British view, the savage slave woman from Africa. And again, if you remember from my lecture from chapter 1, slaves were seen as animals to sell. They were discriminated against in the worst horrible of ways, and whipped and tortured in the most horrible of ways. So here we see with the Virginia law, again, these African slave women are taxed just like a man, but white women don't have the tax with their work because they want women to go back into the home. When you work and you get your paycheck, you get taxed. I get taxed. I get a paycheck, and then I look at my paycheck and I see the taxes were taken by the government. It hurts. It hurts. You know this. Do you work? You know what this is like. But in other words, they were treating these women as they were treating the men, these slave women as they were treating the men, because they wanted the white women back in the home. I hope this makes sense to you. If not, send me an email. We'll talk. So therefore, we have our third talking point, which is, I named it the underling class of women slaves, because, again, they were treated the worst of the worst. They were viewed by the Europeans as savages. Okay, they were not the same status. They didn't have the same culture. They didn't have the same religion, clothes, language, etc., like a British would, a British person would. The British viewed themselves and their culture and their ways much more superior and sophisticated than that of the African slave. The Virginia law of 1662 left slave women vulnerable to rape because there were penalties put on white men who raped black slave women. But this was not true for the owner of the slave. So oftentimes it was the case that the slave owner raped these slave women, and they had the power to do so, so they did, and there was no penalty against it. We're going to go to our next slide with the painting and take a look at this. So here we have our painting by a 19th century artist, in which to the left, the slave owner is freely assaulting the slave, and he feels like he owns her. He has the right to do so. It's his priority, and no one can stop him. To the right, slave man is getting beat up and tortured, and again, this white male slave owner has the freedom to do so with no penalty. What you end up having is, with these rapes, sexual exploitation, pregnancies, all kinds of stuff. Just a horrible, horrible time in history. But if we move on to our next slide, we are here talking about the voodoo queen Marie Laveau. Voodoo is this cultural form of African American religion that was developed by enslaved West Africans with the French, Spanish, and Creole populations of Louisiana. This voodoo culture, when we talk about the Creole population, Creole was the original term used by the French to refer to the black slave population in Louisiana. And then Creole over time also referred to the mixture of French and African people coming together, their heritage. There's a lot of things that I could tell you about voodoo. I actually went to New Orleans. I have to do it. There is a house in New Orleans. And you're viewing this right now and you're like, what is she doing? Why is she singing this? Usually in my lectures in class, I like to break out in song. I've got a little bit of some issues. But getting back to New Orleans, I went there maybe 2 years ago, and I went into the Museum of Voodoo, and it was kind of scary because when I went to the front desk to sign in and to pay to get into the museum, the man had a snake around his neck, and I had to walk in this small hallway. I mean, this is like an old home, from like the 1800s, and I had to go past the snake. And when you went into the House of Voodoo, you saw paintings of Marie Laveau and some other voodoo queens of the day. There's also shrines set up with the, oh my heavens, the dolls, the little voodoo dolls, which were meant to, you take the doll and you can prick it, and it's like a symbolic way of hurting someone you don't like or killing them. So they had shrines set up dedicated to people who died, and people would come to the museum and leave things that meant something to them in dedication to those people. It could be money, it could be, I saw makeup, believe it or not, all kinds of different things left on the altar. And what's interesting is that there was an article in which the Pope back in the 90s actually recognized voodoo as an official religion. Voodoo incorporates this, what they consider the religion of the West Africans, and these influences from the French and the Spanish and the Creole with that of Christianity. And Marie Laveau did just that. She was born free as the daughter of a Creole woman who was married to the mayor of New Orleans. She was a very popular woman in her time in 1874. Thousands upon thousands of black and white New Orleans residents would come to see her. People that ranged from politicians to businessmen to the wealthy, all the way to the poor and the enslaved, came to her for either spiritual advice or business-related decisions or financial advice. She didn't discriminate. She helped everyone and anyone from the upper echelons to the lower classes. She was believed to have special powers, that she could predict things, and people really gravitated towards her. She would attend Catholic Mass as a way to protect her true beliefs and as a way to adopt Catholic practices into her voodoo system. So she would have people come to her to buy voodoo dolls and potions and predict certain things and help them with these decisions. Even today, her gravesite is still a major source of tourist attraction. So even today. So now that we've gotten a little view of that of the southern colonies, and we talked about the upper classes of women versus the lower classes of women and the need for the slave labor, we're going to the colonies of the North. We're seeing a difference from that Chesapeake area or that southern colony area versus the northern colony area held by the British, that of New England. And we see that there were differences. And, you've got differences of geography, for example. You've got differences of climate. But you have differences of lifestyle and culture. And that comes in the form of religion. Puritans. Okay, so our next focus is on the Puritans. The Puritans, living in Great Britain, believed in John Calvin's belief that God's word would order all steps of life. So the Puritan beliefs were based off of John Calvin. Again, if you recall the time period of the Protestant Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, in which Martin Luther broke away from the Catholic Church. Martin Luther establishes Lutheranism, and then you have offshoots from that, one of them being Calvinism. Well, Puritans were a form of that Calvinist belief, or a group from that belief. And so you have Puritans in Great Britain in the 17th century who were either separatists or non-separatists. Non-separatist Puritans wanted to purify the church, but not separate from it. Separatist Puritans wanted to separate from the church and make their lifestyle, their religion as pure as possible. At the time period in Britain, the Puritans found a lot of issue with the king. They felt that the king was corrupting their church, creating laws and creating traditions within the church that were not pure. They had such an issue with this that it led some Puritans, the separatist Puritans, to literally leave their home of Great Britain, travel over the seas, and search for a new colony, a new home, where their religion and their practices could be as pure, as close to their beliefs as they saw fit and they believed to be true. And so we just celebrate Thanksgiving. I'm recording this session right after Thanksgiving. But if you remember, like in elementary school, you had to dress up either as a Native American or a Pilgrim and celebrate that time period of Thanksgiving. And so here we are with the Puritan Migration, with the original Plymouth colony established in 1620 by the Pilgrims, looking for earning God's saving grace through creating the most perfect, pure colony that God would see fit, as pure and as traditional as possible. Puritans had a very, very deep, extremely deep religious belief in their religion and in God, so much so that it consumed their everyday life. Today, what's our life like in general? Our life is, education, that's part of it. But what are you doing in your free time? Watching TV, going to the movies, you're on your iPad, whatever you're doing. Totally different world, totally different times. Imagine shutting yourself out from all technology, living on the land. That's what they were doing. That's what they had. What did they have back then, right? And so the Puritans, like I said before, were very, very deep into their religion and their faith. And so the Puritan colony was just one of these many colonies that were established by the Puritans. Another colony that was established by John Winthrop. Winthrop was a prominent lawyer and landholder and devout Puritan. He took his people, his Puritan people, across the seas to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1642. Winthrop gave a speech that's entitled "A Model of Christian Charity," in which he considered his colony an example for others to follow. It was a light from God for others to follow, his colony. And so his colony had to be as pure in faith, in family, in traditional gender roles and law as he saw and God saw fit according to Puritan belief system. So it's safe to say that the colony was fully controlled by these Puritan beliefs. Well, here we have this disorderly woman known as Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was one of 13 children in her family that lived in this colony. In 1635, when she was young, she had been raised by her family. Her father had been in prison for heresy, so she did come from a little bit of an untraditional family. And when we say heresy, we mean that he was imprisoned for going against the traditional Puritan faith. Well, she did just the same as her father. When she was living in this colony, she was going to meetings at homes in which she gave her interpretation of the Bible to women. And she was preaching the sermon. Oh, no, no, no. That was not her place. That was the place of an ordained male minister to do that, not her. So her belief and her practice completely went against the Puritan faith and also practice of gender roles. She taught that if you have an individual sense of being saved, then you are saved from evil, from corruption, and you don't need God and you don't need a minister to do that. She taught that the Spirit was independent of the Bible and sermons. She even tried to establish her own church. Well, when word got round, John Winthrop said, and I quote, "This was not tolerable, nor comely in the sight of God, nor fitting for your sex." She was put on trial, and it was found that her weaknesses in her argument, in other words, she didn't want to prove that she broke the law, the Puritan law. Therefore, she was banished from the colony. She fled to the other colony of Rhode Island, where she was able to establish her own community of believers. Okay. So we go from this one disorderly woman in the Massachusetts Bay Colony who was kicked out, another disorderly woman, that of Tituba. So before I start talking about who Tituba was, let's talk about the Salem witch trials in New England, which occurred between 1692 and 1693. If you know anything about the Salem witch trials, which I assume you have some knowledge of, it was the time period when these two young girls, Abigail Williams and her cousin Elizabeth Parris, were breaking out into these almost like epileptic fits. They were having like seizures. They were screaming. They were talking in what seemed to be different languages. They seemed to be possessed, long story short. From then on, this whole concept of their possession led to a court trial in which the two girls and others were accusing other people within the colony of, in Salem, of witchcraft. And many people lost their lives because they were accused of being witches and being possessed by Satan himself. So Tituba had met with these two girls. Tituba was a slave from Barbados, and these two girls, Abigail and Betty, and some of their other friends met with Tituba and explained to them, look, we're basically possessed by the devil. What do we do? Well, in West African tradition, and other slave tradition, it was not uncommon to do these special types of potions or special rituals to get rid of evil spirits. And that's what Tituba did. She created a witch cake in which she mixed special cake mixture and Betty Parris's urine, and she baked it, and she did a special ritual and had her eat it to get rid of this evil spirit. Well, for that, Tituba was put on trial, and she was, she confessed to what she did. She said, yeah, I was practicing this ritual, but it was just to help this girl. And for that, she was put into jail. Luckily for her, she was not hung like the others were. She was actually released from jail a year later, and that's because some unknown person paid her fees for the release. So, in conclusion, the southern colonies versus the northern colonies, we see, and what I focused on with this lecture, is a huge difference. When you read the book, there's other things, but for our purpose in this lecture, the big difference here was the religion. In northern British colonies, the Puritan belief system, very, very strong. The southern colonies, what we see is definitely a focus on the views and expectations of the roles of the women, the white women versus the black enslaved women. There's also expectations when we look at the place of Anne Hutchinson, a woman taking on this role that a man minister would do. Okay, and there's other things that we can draw to from the chapter. which you will do in your discussion. Thank you so much for sitting through my lecture. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you for Chapter 3.